I'm here with Ross Levine. He's a professor at Brown University, a member of the National Bureau for Economic Research. The theme of this conference is long-run sustainable growth. And Professor Levine has done a study recently that shows you can't achieve that unless you have the proper regulatory foundations. Thank you very much for joining us. And I want to back into what you're talking about by asking you how far from that we are right now. You hear a lot of people say that we have a very confusing, unsettled regulatory regime that is not only making it difficult for the economy to grow, but making it difficult for companies to operate.
No, I think that that's true. In the United States, the regulatory regime is still unsettled, and hence the incentives facing the financial institutions are unclear, and that helps explain, it certainly doesn't fully explain, some of the reluctance of the banks to lend to the private sector in order to promote growth. I think in terms of talking about regulatory regimes more broadly, the types of regulatory regimes that are going to induce banks to provide lots of opportunities for businesses, there the problem is that the appropriate regulatory regimes differ in the United States and in other countries. So it's not possible to have one regulatory regime that's going to promote growth in all countries.
And you talked about incentives, and that's kind of the main thrust of where regulation should go.
Right.
Try to get people to do the right thing.
Right. So here we can talk about incentives along two different dimensions. So one way to talk about incentives is the incentives of the regulators themselves. So a lot of what's going on around the world, a lot of what's going on in Dodd-Frank within the context of the United States, is to give the regulators more power over the financial institutions. But the degree to which that's going to be successful depends on the incentives of the regulators. Are they going to act in the best interests of the public? How heavily are they influenced by the financial institutions themselves? And so one way to improve financial regulation is to try to enhance the governance of the regulatory institutions themselves. The other part of the incentives, the other part of your question focuses on the incentives of the financial institutions. So part of Dodd-Frank is meant to improve the ability of the investors in banks to monitor what's going on in banks and to induce them to invest in sound investments.
I've only got about 30 seconds left, but are you optimistic with where we are now that we can get there?
Not in the short run. I'm pessimistic because regulation relies on two ingredients. One is the incentives of the regulators, and the second is the incentives of the private investors in banks. And right now, both of those have been weakened by the crisis and the response to the crisis.
Professor Levine, thank you very much for joining us. We'll look forward to the presentation
Thank
of your
you for
paper
inviting
here
me.
tomorrow.